Hi there. In this video, we're going to go over shadow work for men, confronting inner demons. My name is Christopher, and my coaching business is Humble Fox Consultations. And with that, let's get right into it. So to start off, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple different sources where I got some information from. We have Memory, Dreams, and Reflections, which is Carl Jung's autobiography, Jung's Map of the Soul by Murray Stein, which is a great introduction to Jung's understanding of the human psyche, and there's some shadow material in here as well. And then Robert Bly wrote a book called A Little Book on the Human Shadow, which I recommend checking out further as well. And I wanted to give us a little quotation from Robert Bly's book here. So he says, every part of our personality that we do not love will become hostile to us. And that is a good nutshell for what the human shadow is. So before we dive in, I also want to take a moment to honor and respect the shadow, because we're entering into sacred ground. When we talk about these aspects, we're talking about something that is numinous and something that has a quality that is deeper than the rational mind. So I want to honor and respect that before we dive in. This is the structure of the psyche. I did an entire video on this. If you want to go further into it, today we're going to be talking about the shadow, which has its grips into the conscious mind, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. And so just to give a little bit of a understanding of the psyche of the structure. So in order to define the shadow, I really like what Robert Bly says about this, but this is a gross oversimplification. But basically he says that there are aspects of our personality that have been deemed unacceptable, unlovable, undesirable, etc. So as children, we were born 360-degree balls of light. We were born with a complete expression of everything inside of us, from screaming to anger to crying to laughing to joy to what have you. And over time, we were conditioned by our caregivers towards certain aspects of our personality that were favorable to them. Maybe our parents didn't like when we were out screaming in the middle of a restaurant, and perhaps some of us were shamed or told that crying or showing vulnerability wasn't okay. And so we decided, not consciously, this is a very unconscious process, to hide these aspects of ourselves and deem them unlovable. And just like Robert Bly's quote said, any part of us that is unlovable will come back to haunt us, essentially, because they're still there. They still have needs and desires inside of us. So how does Carl Jung define the shadow? So we have essentially these three aspects here. We have our persona, which is like our outer mask, the layer that we show to the external world, the smile we put on our face, no matter how we may be feeling on the inside. We have the ego, which is sort of like this permeable membrane that allows unconscious contents to seep in from the unconscious. And many people misidentify the ego as the persona. The persona is typically the aspect that people talk about when they say, like, oh, my ego is always getting in the way. The ego is a tool. It really is. It's how we can, we actually in Jungian psychology want to strengthen our ego. It's very common for people to say about like narcissistic personalities that they have a very strong ego, and we actually want to have a strong ego because it allows us to process more unconscious material. To have a strong persona or a false self is a completely different situation, and that's something we definitely want to work with, is that we want our shadow and our persona to have a relationship with each other. And when they don't, that's when we can kind of develop those narcissistic personality disorders, because what doesn't end up in the personality, like we have right here, everything that does not go in the personality goes into the shadow. And so what our attempt is to bring everything out into the shadow, into the personality as much as we can. And there will always be an element that is unintegratable in the shadow, because there's part of it that goes into the collective. And the shadow is something that we can work with, but it's something that's there as well. The shadow is typically needs that we may have that are not acceptable by our culture. Many of these could be needs for sexuality, needs for validation, needs for love. These are all natural human needs inside of us, and we may not want to present them to other people, but they're still there. And so the shadow will find ways to enact these and get these out without our ego being aware of it, right? And so that's kind of the little moral conundrum that we get into, is that we have these needs, but they may not work well within the societal conditions that we have been given from our early childhood. And so natural human qualities that tend to get from the shadow: hatred, fear, anger, greed, jealousy, sexuality, selfishness, all of these have a need of some kind inside of us, and they don't go away. They still find ways to enact themselves. And so our work in integrating the shadow is to go back and to find these needs and to discover what they need from us, and so that we can start having that dialogue and get these needs met in healthy ways, as opposed to these needs just coming online, taking control, and doing something extremely irrational, like through addiction or violence or sexually acting out in some particular way. Because those needs don't go away, they're always there. So how does the shadow typically show up in men? I really think that this picture does a great job illustrating some of the cultural conditioning that I know in America that I received as a child, and I think is common to many men across the world, is that we have these words like, don't be a pussy, don't be feminine in any way, men don't cry, don't be a wimp, man up, stop being such a girl, be a man. This word be a man here, it doesn't actually mean anything. What does that mean, be a man? It doesn't have a intellectual context, but when I hear that, I can feel in my body what somebody is implying when they say be a man. And it makes me feel shamed in some way, as if there's a certain way men are supposed to be. And so typically what has happened to us as men is that as children, we were extremely sensitive and emotional and outgoing and creative, and emotions are typically in our culture, in society, a womanly trait. It's not really common for men to experience emotions. We also have this messed up idea of stoicism, that somehow being stoic means not feeling your emotions or being this robotic presence and rational sense of self. And that is that means that our sense of feeling is what has ended up in our shadow. In our culture, it's considered weak to act like a woman, so we reject anything that is feminine. Hence, don't be a pussy, as if somehow being a woman is a weakness in some way. And then as children, we get shamed as little boys to reject anything that may resemble womanly traits, including, our own homophobia, including our connection with other boys, including our ability to relate to ourselves in emotional capacity, our ability to feel our intuition, that feminine side that exists inside of us as humans. We also have masculine emotions that are allowed. So for instance, contrary to societal beliefs, men are actually extremely sensitive and emotional creatures. We're humans. We are mammals. We are emotional beings. And whether or not we may like to think that, we have emotions inside of us at our core, and those emotions are actually what make us who we are, and our authentic self is in those emotions. And one of the only acceptable emotions for men to express in our culture is anger, and that's typically how we as men have been conditioned to express ourselves, is that we may be like completely flat and nice guy and not expressing a lot of emotion, then out of nowhere blowing up in a violent anger storm. If we're not constantly working with and feeling our emotions. Another way to say what I just expressed is that inside of many men's shadows is the capacity to feel emotions. Our sadness, our grief, our anger. It's our capacity to feel our emotions, which is where our strength actually lies, is in our vulnerability, in our ability to connect with the authenticity of who we are at our core moment to moment. It's not in the ability to siphon off and hide our emotions away from us. Gabor Mate talks about, as children, it was not safe to feel. And the reason for this is that as children, our need for connection with our caregivers is greater than our need for authenticity. And so we sacrifice who we are, our authenticity, and those parts of ourselves that are deemed unlovable, so that we can have connection with our caregivers, because that is what we had to do to survive. And James Hillman talks about this, and he wants to acknowledge that we must forgive ourselves for that, because we did the right thing, because we did what we had to do in order to survive. So part of coming back into alignment with our shadow is to forgive ourselves for siphoning off who we are in the first place. We have this part of ourselves that feels rejected because at some level we have rejected that part, and we have to forgive ourselves for that rejection. And that is a moment-to-moment practice. And so we were more willing to fulfill the need for connection than we were the need for authenticity. And that's how we get sort of a people-pleasing persona, a nice guy persona, the need for validation seeking. That all comes from early childhood dynamics in our family of origin and things that we had in acting with our caregivers. So signs of the shadow in men: 1, emotional avoidance. Many men obviously suppressing our emotions. This idea of stoicism, whereas if you actually read what the Stoics, Aurelius may have said, that they actually do feel their emotions, that stoicism involves feeling emotions, and it's in a sense being equanimous with what is coming to us moment to moment. It's not in not feeling emotions, it's in feeling the emotion fully. And so many men will then resort to, aggression and anger, because that is the only emotion that is allowed to show in men. And especially when we have been trained in our culture to be nice guys, then all of our anger gets pushed down and it's locked in this pressure chamber that eventually kind of blows every once in a while. And then we put the lid back on, and we may say things to our partners or to people in our lives who are close to us whenever we have a violent outburst, like, oh, that was so out of character for me, or oh, I'm really not like that. That's the shadow inside of us that comes out every once in a while. The shadow comes out through addictive behaviors, mainly through the need for connection to something spiritual in our lives, connection to other people. We have these needs inside of us that weren't met as children, and so we sometimes try to self-medicate in order to meet these needs, and it works for a little bit until it doesn't. Perfectionism and control, just trying to control who we are and putting unrealistic expectations on ourselves as a way to not feel the shame and inadequacy inside of ourselves, especially as men. We have conditioning that we're supposed to be successful and breadwinners, and there can be pride in that, and there can be some absolute beauty in that of taking care of a family, but then there can also be the other side, which is the perfectionistic and image seeking of what a man is supposed to be. And then we have intimacy issues, obviously just difficulty in feeling and being vulnerable with our partners, and then being a nice guy. Many of us learn as little boys that we had to be nice little boys in order to please our caregivers and put on a smile, even though maybe the family unit was completely terrifying around us and we didn't feel that we were being loved or taken care of properly. Now, I also want to acknowledge here that no family is a perfect family, that every family has something. Even in the quote-unquote good families, there's still wounds and imprints that are left from our childhood dynamics, and so it's up to us to go in and discover those. So we also have societal pressures that causes the shadow in us men. So we have traditional masculine norms, this idea that we're not supposed to feel emotions, that we're supposed to be tough and and it's actually in our vulnerability that we find our deepest strengths. We have a stigma around mental health as well. It's really difficult, I find, with a lot of the men that I work with, just asking for help. And I've had a lot of men actually, initiate that process of asking for help, and they get really scared and pull away as well. Because as men, we're supposed to be individuals and not supposed to rely on anybody else. And there's this idea of independence that also surrounds our masculinity. So in our shadow may be the need for dependence, a pressure to succeed. Obviously, we as men have this idea that we are only valuable if we can produce or succeed. That's sort of the masculine ideal it's imposed on women in our society today too. It's imposed onto men that we must succeed in order to have value, in order to feel worthy, in order to be loved. And then we have, obviously, there are toxic masculine ideals. I really don't like that idea of toxic masculinity. I made an entire video on that if you want to check it out, but it's really toxic masculinity is wounded masculinity, that we have to quote unquote show dominance when we're feeling very insecure inside. And so that actually stems from a deep internal wounding that happens inside of us. And then lack of masculine role models. There are not too many men that can name a lot of men in their life who they truly look up to, apart from maybe a couple of celebrities, and but true men who they can look to as an elder, as a mentor in their life. And so the idea that we as men have to be the initiators for the men younger than us as well. We have to look for and find younger men to help them through their process, their rites, their initiations. So how do we integrate the shadow? First of all, we can talk to our shadow. It's a very Jungian idea. It's active imagination. We can speak to parts in our psyche, create some sacred space. Like I mentioned earlier, we must forgive ourselves for abandoning this part of who we are. A great way to start integrating or finding where the shadow lies is, where do you judge other people? When you judge other people about something, whether it be the way that they look, the way that they act, their behaviors, whatever it may be, we can take that judgment and look straight down and recognize, oh, I'm judging that about myself, and that's why I'm projecting this judgment onto other people. Dream work is a fantastic way to start getting into the shadow. We can start seeing what the psyche actually is producing inside of us without the blinders of the ego and the persona when we do our dream work. Robert Bly talks about eating the shadow. We must eat the shadow. We don't want to overwhelm the ego by producing too much unconscious material, but we do want to start eating the shadow, and that means integrating and becoming that part of ourselves that we may fear or unlove, and start to work with that. A great way to start doing this is working with specialists who know how to work with the shadow, and then going on retreats as well. And we must own all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it's all part of us. We're human, and we have these deep, complex, animalistic parts of ourselves that exist inside of us, as well as these beautiful and radiant parts that we're also equally as afraid of. And I also want to talk about that too, is that we are also afraid of our light more so than we are our darkness. It's actually our light that we fear the most, because the power and the intention that it may give us. And this is what can lead to the ideas of fear of success, which the fear of being seen. We actually may hide in order to not feel what it feels like to be put on the attention block. Even though some of us may crave attention, there are these interesting dynamics that occur within the psyche. So this idea comes from Richard Short's, which is No Bad Parts, which is that every aspect of our humanity is worthy of love. So in order to integrate the shadow, everything in the human psyche serves a purpose. So understand there are no bad parts inside of us, that everything inside of us, including our greed, our hate, our anger, our sexuality, whatever it may be that you may deem unlovable, serves a purpose inside of us and deserves and has a voice to speak. So we don't want to get rid of anything. We're not here to rip out parts of the shadow. We're here to become those parts of ourselves that we originally deemed as unlovable. And then to remember that a lot of this happened in our childhood, so some deep inner child work is needed inside of us. So how can we start measuring our shadow work? Well, a great way to do this is, how much do you change around different people? So when you're in different environments with different friends or your coworkers or your parents, how much are you changing when you're with, maybe a romantic partner versus your friends? Can you be who you are moment to moment, or are you constantly shape-shifting and becoming something that other people need you to be in order for you to feel loved and validated? That's how you can start determining whether or not you're integrating the shadow, is actually the less you can start caring about what other people think about you. What we repress, we regress. So this idea that Robert Bly talked about in that quote at the beginning, that those parts of ourselves that we disown will actually become hostile towards us. They actually do not develop at the same rate as the parts that have been integrated into us have. They've actually been stuck in that childhood state of the moment and have regressed a little bit as well. And so during this process of shadow work, it's like holding a little child and walking them through the stages of development in order to meet you in the adulthood. And so I wanted to leave you off with this little comic here, because to understand that everything that we see in the external world actually exists inside of us, because we only see it through our nervous system in our understanding of ourselves. So we have met the enemy, and he is us. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in. If you would like to do some shadow work, I work with men, and we typically do shadow work, dream work. I do childhood trauma and attachment work as well. So if you want to start diving into this, feel free to schedule a call down below, and we can start chatting about what working together would look like. If you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, I spend some time making these videos for you and your enjoyment and your healing. And so like and subscribe, and feel free to share this with anyone who may benefit. Other than that, thank you so much for tuning in, and I will catch you in the next one.